Okay, next up is Mike Van Oat
Thank you.
with Jimmy Crack Corn and Moonshining in lava tubes in the Flagstaff area. Here you go, Mike.
No free samples. Depending on a moonshine, you might not want a free sample. How do I shift slides here? Down there. Okay, got it. As it says, there's several caves east of Kinder Peak contain historic material and other evidence suggestive of manufacturing of moonshine. Now, I'm not going to suggest that the 5 caves that I'm going to discuss all were necessarily involved in moonshining, but there's strong evidence very strong evidence for 2 of them being used, pretty good evidence for a third one, and some evidence for the other 2. So this is what we're going to talk about. So moonshine is a distillate, and it's illegal. Okay, just push the down and nothing's happening. Base bar. No. We're doing here. Oh, you just push this one. Okay, I've been asked not to give names and specific locations, so this is a pretty general map you're looking at up there. You can see there's lots of lava tubes or lava caves, but not all of them have been used. The ones that I believe possibly were used are indicated in the black dots here. You'll notice the railroad grade shown on the map down in the right-hand corner, and we'll discuss that later. So what is moonshine? High-proof liquor, generally whiskey, traditionally made or distributed illegally. You'll see stuff sold as moonshine. It's not. Moonshine's illegal. That's what makes it. That's why it's done in the moon. Okay, whiskey. What's whiskey? Whiskey is made from grains. And initially, you got to make a beer. And so, you make what's called a grain mash. You want to wet the grain, and the grain will start to sprout just a little bit. And what that does is that converts sugars into starches, or excuse me, starches into sugars, makes it more easier to ferment for the yeast. A little bit of information on alcohol. I put this in here just because I thought it was interesting. The eyeliner coal that you see in the Mideast is the origination of the word alcohol. It was an Akkadian word for the sublimation of the mineral stibnite, which was considered the essence or spirits of the mineral. And later on, that term got referred to, in distillation. The Arabs also referred to it as the spirit, the essence of the material that they would distill alcohol from, and hence we refer to it as alcohol as spirits. Ethanol is the alcohol that we're talking about. Comes from a lot of different options, but what you want to do is you want to make beer. You don't want to use hops, and not if you're going to make whiskey out of it. The grains have to be malted. The malting process is the wetting of the grains, causing them to sprout, again, producing available sugars, which normally would make the plant grow. But in this case, we're letting yeast eat it, and the yeast is turning it into alcohol. Malted grain is cracked, so you do you don't really grind it real fine. You just want to kind of crush it. The old song, Gimme Crack Corn, is about the slaves celebrating, and some people may or may not know this, basically having a jubilee. They're now free. They're taking the master's corn and they're making whiskey and they're celebrating. And that's where that term comes from. So you want to sterilize the mash by heating it, and that breaks down some of the fermentable starches and other sugars. And you can add yeast to it, or wild yeast will take over if it sits there long enough. The finished product is what we normally call beer. We usually throw some hops in there to help preserve it. But if you're making whiskey, you really don't want to have a bunch of bitter hops in there. So further processing of whiskey can occur, but it's rare with moonshine. That's why we call it white lightning. We don't age it in cask or anything like that. It has been done. There's lots of history behind and discussion about how aging with charred cask came about. But this is pretty rare in moonshine, so we're going to skip through that. If you got any questions, whoops, let me back up here. What makes it illegal? It begins with the whiskey tax of 1791. Congress had to pay off the war debts for the Revolutionary War. The states had debts and the federal government had debts. 16 to 18 cents a gallon was the tax. That's almost $2 to $6 a gallon in today's dollars. Lump sum payment could be made, which tended to favor, of course, larger stills. Small farmers relied, and you may remember this from your history classes way back when you were a kid, they pretty much relied on being able to make whiskey and ship it out because it was a lot cheaper than trying to ship several bushels of grain out. And it was a cash crop for them. And so when the whiskey tax was passed, there was a lot of objection to it. 1794, U.S. Marshal arrived in Western Pennsylvania serving writs to distillers who had not paid the excise tax. 500 small farmers attacked the home of Inspector General John Neville, who himself was a distiller who had originally been opposed to the tax. 2 to 3 people were killed. Washington sent peace negotiators while at the same time asking the state governors to send a militia, 13,000 people, which Washington rode at the head of. The rebels went home. Conflict was generally avoided. Some people were arrested. All were later either acquitted or pardoned. So that was kind of the first local with rebellion. Distillers in Kentucky were particularly intransigent. Over the next 6 years, 175 distillers would be convicted of violating the tax law. This whiskey tax was not liked. Jefferson, being a friend of the rural people, small farmers, his administration did eliminate the tax, but by then moonshining was already a tradition. So that's basically how it originated. Now, it was probably a pretty good quality product and made by local people who were just trying to, save a little money on the side on the tax, et cetera, et cetera. But with Prohibition, that changed things. Here in Arizona, surprisingly enough, Prohibition occurred 5 years prior to the national moratorium. And this was not first state, but number 13 to go dry before Prohibition. Payson Dew was a famous moonshine made in the Payson area. Oh, where am I here? Oh, okay, Payson Dew. They were filming a lot of Zane Grey movies out of the Payson area during Prohibition, and the local moonshine got to be so famous it was traded to Hollywood. So we're not talking about Payson Dew. We're going to talk about the area up around Flagstaff. Prior to Prohibition, there were 8 saloons in Flagstaff and 15 in Williams. Now, Williams is a pretty small town. You think about having 15 bars. That just shows you that there was a demand for alcohol in those days. Afterwards, everything was peace and quiet on the outside. One quote from a newspaper: logging camps are filled with men and the sawmills are running full blast. All the saloon buildings are occupied by other businesses. Yeah, right. With Prohibition, moonshiners were situated for great profit. Unfortunately, in much of the country, and perhaps here in Arizona to some degree, organized crime involvement became a big thing because it was big money. They were essentially the narco-traficantes of the time. They weren't opposed to, throwing a little isopropanol in there to give it kick. They weren't opposed to, they didn't really care if somebody used a car radiator for a condenser, resulting in subsequent lead poisoning and things like that. So when you hear about people going blind from moonshine, it's not just blind drunk. Often there was contaminants. Again, doesn't mean all moonshine was that way. This is a typical still. It's a pretty simple apparatus. You got your mash, you strain out, you put it in the still pot. You've got a cap to seal it, and you run it down through a coil like that. Often you'll run that coil through a barrel with ice water that helps the condensation of the alcohol. The alcohol itself boils off at a lower temperature than water, and so it it's you don't really want a wood grain fire. You just want a nice, slow simmer. So what are the requirements for making moonshine? Well, you got to have a secure hidden location. The lava tubes up here, especially the ones that, with the exception of one that I'm going to talk about, They're all on low lava ridges, but because you hike up to the top of the ridge, you really don't see the sinks until you're right at them. You can see in this picture, somebody standing there, not much sign of a sink in front of them. And this is in a big open burn area now. It would have been forested back then, but you can see it's a fairly large sinkhole. And on one end, we have a pretty good sized cave. And on the other end, there's also an entrance. Here's the exception to the rule. This is a very small cave out in the flats. Like I say, most of them are up on the ridges. This one's hard to find just because it's small and it's kind of rolling lava in there. There's another cave. Again, you can see the person standing there, and you really can't see the cave till you're right up on it. So all the caves that have some evidence for possible moonshining all have these, well, hard to see until you're right on top of them entrances. This one's a great one here. I mean, she's standing right in front of the cave and you can't see it. You can step down into this entrance. It doesn't take much to hide them. Way to make mash. So you need to soak the grain so that it sprouts just a little bit. Well, a couple of these caves have these, I don't know if there's a way to get rid of this, or you can see that. Well, you can see it fine. I've got something on the screen here. Galvanized tubs, which would be ideal for taking a burlap sack full of corn, and corn was the grain used for most moonshining. You could possibly also use a 55-gallon drum. This drum may not be old enough, but it's hard to say. You also could use a large wooden barrel, as the pieces of wood on the right there show you. So there's certainly stuff that could have been used for sprouting the grain. And then you need to ferment it in something. Well, several of these caves have these barrel bands and wooden staves, indicating that they had a number of barrels in them at one time, which would be what you would typically ferment them in. Of course, the 55-gallon drum could have been a fermenter as well. You also need a still. This is a part of an old boiler sitting outside the entrance of one cave. Could have been used for a still. Not absolutely saying that it was. It's entirely possible that they had a still and it's disappeared. I suspect that the still was moved from cave to cave, since more than one of these caves indicates being used. You need to have a fire to heat the still up. Well, these caves have charcoal in them. They have, pieces of wood that are burned, pieces of obvious, firewood cut and stacked in one cave, and cave A. You can go back, there's a crawlway, and off to the side in the crawlway is a bunch of charcoal that got thrown there. And you go, why would you try to hide this stuff? And of course, all this would indicate a certain degree of secrecy about the cave, which we'll also talk about. So other elements found in some caves include large beams and railroad ties, 55-gallon drum, rock walls. One of the main caves has rock walls. I originally thought they were built to obstruct view. It's possible they also were used for climate control, because these caves do get ice in the winter, and if it's too cold, you won't get fermentation, or at least it'll be very slow. Typical fermentation in reasonably warm temperatures, most of it occurs in just a few days to couple of weeks on the outside. You'll see some other items: metal cans, glass bottles. There's the railroad ties there. So they were doing railroad logging. Remember, I showed the old railroad grade there. Obviously there's a connection. Here's on the one picture here, you can see remnants of one rock wall with railroad tie. You can see remnants of another rock wall in another cave. Like I say, these may have been to hide stuff going on behind them. One cave has a rock wall, which may be Aboriginal. So, not all these are necessarily historical, but most of these are more recent. There's some more rock walls. And they actually, walled off passages so that you couldn't see down the passages. And these are big rocks. I mean, it probably took 2 or 3 guys. This is a cave. This is cave A. They actually stuck this cut log in here and then piled rocks on it. And when you look at it from the outside, it looks like just a rock pile. There is a little entrance off to one side. In that cave, when you go down and you look through the entrance, you find yourself looking at a rock wall, which in the old days, pre-flashlights, you probably couldn't see very well, and you might not even recognize it as a non-natural wall. That I suspect was the center of operations. This one on the left could be of Aboriginal origin. It's hard to say. You'll see a lot of kerosene cans like this. That would have been something used for either carrying dry grain as a bucket or water. There's an old stovepipe in one of the caves. You can see a charred log here with cut marks on it. Glass bottles. This little metal pan would have been a nice thing for mixing, for making mash, for malting your grain. And you can see a K register. Over on the left here, these are fragments of barrel staves. They are in there, and here's a plug. It looks like probably maybe some sort of a valve off a barrel in another cave. Common elements found in suspected moonshine caves. So here are the caves. Entrance difficult to see or otherwise obscure. Yes, some cases they were deliberately hidden. Evidence for malting. Well, and we got galvanized tubs and steel pans in a couple of caves. Evidence for fermentation. Barrel bands and staves I consider pretty strong evidence. They are in most of the caves there. Evidence of distillation apparatus. We don't really have the still pot. There is a probable boiler outside the entrance of one cave. Could have been used as a still pot. Cave B, there's a piece of 3/4 inch pipe, which undoubtedly was used to connect the still pot with the condensing unit, or the condensing unit with wherever they were ultimately dripping the alcohol in. Evidence for fire. Almost all these have evidence for fire: charred beams, logs. Some of the beams are charred. I suspect they were used to support a still apparatus, and the sides were charred from the heat. Let's see. This is a jar fragment found at the entrance of one of the caves. The date is 1915. That's when Prohibition started in Arizona. That's maybe a coincidence, but it's a pretty good one. Just happens to be that date. Just again, a lot of this is somewhat circumstantial. So what was the market? Well, they may have shipped it to Flagstaff, but they may have not had to gone that far. This is the LiDAR. You can see the old railroad grade about a 1/4 mile from one of the suspect caves. You know, there's a lot of logging going on. It was brutal work back in those days. They didn't have chainsaws. They were, you know, they ran rails. They had to build the tracks and haul the logs out on wheeled carts. And sometimes they used steam donkeys. Sometimes they used oxen. But you know, it was brutal work. And so there was a need for entertainment and anesthetic, and I suspect that some of it was sold locally. I wish I had done more research here in terms of, you could probably look at the barrel bands and count them and size them and figure out, you know, what the potential production was. I'm doing a guess that there were probably 10 barrels in use, 30-gallon size barrels. Some of them are probably larger, some smaller, but just as a general rule, you should be able to get about a 10% alcohol mix off your fermentation, which would yield you a gallon of pure ethanol out of 10 gallons of mash. So if you've got a 30-gallon barrel, 3 gallons of moonshine, up to 30 gallons of moonshine per production run. However, they probably didn't use all these caves at once. They were probably moving around to, you know, keep from being noticed. But at that time, moonshine was going for about $25 a gallon, which is about $325 in today's money. So it was pretty good money, especially money was tight back then. We were going into the Depression later on. Maybe in 1915, things were still roaring pretty good. If you're in these caves, and I'm sure a lot of you have been in some of these caves, always, of course, you know, leave the artifacts undisturbed where they're found. Watch where you place your feet. Old barrel stays are particularly difficult to see in the mud. Some caves have been used by Aboriginal people, and some are used by bats. The bat usage in these caves seems to be irregular and seasonal, but if you're seeing large numbers of bats, you probably just should leave and come back at a different date. Any questions?
I had a question, go ahead and repeat. Where do you think their water source was?
Where was their water source? Their water source, I think actually, let me go back here for a second.
Were there any?
Yeah, here, water present from mash and fermentation. Ice in winter would have been a good water source. They could have collected ice in the winter, thawed it out in the back of the cave. These caves all get ice in the winter to the best of my knowledge. Some of them I haven't gotten to in the winter, but I've been to several in early spring as soon as the roads are open, and they have a lot of ice. I'm sure you're familiar with Slate Lakes Cave, which isn't one of these. I don't think Slate got used because I think it was too well known and too obvious of an entrance, but there's a tremendous amount of ice there in the winter. It's, you know, it actually flows down into the passage for maybe 100 feet. Any other?
Why was Arizona instituting prohibition like 5 years before?
Repeat the question.
Okay, why was prohibition so early in Arizona? I don't know, other than there was a general surge toward prohibition for quite a period of time prior to the federal prohibition. Like I say, there were 13 states. Arizona was number 13. It could have come from several sources. It could have come from employers who were having a problem. You know, you sort of get that hint in that newspaper quote about, you know, all the mills are running and the logging camps and everybody's.
I mean, most of our economy back at the start of Arizona was like either ranching, farming,
Yeah.
mining, logging.
And being a shortly distant from the frontier society, liquor has always played a big part in frontier, you know, society. I mean, the fur trappers, they didn't drink all the time, but when they did, they got serious about it. And
Okay.
all right, thank you.
And